Welcome back to ENG484A Bible is Literature at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I am Roberta Sabbath, and I'm here to talk about Isaiah, Ruth, Job, and the Song of Songs. As you might remember in our previous lectures, the Hebrew Bible is composed of the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the wisdom literature. So what we have here now are samples of Isaiah, who is considered a prophet, and Ruth, Job, and Song of Songs, books that are in the wisdom literature or writings. What we see in each of them is something that I think is particularly relevant to this course. Obviously, we can't cover everything. Isaiah is an important prophet, perhaps the most important, the first listed in the Hebrew Bible. And some of his predictions are referenced by Christianity and serve to justify the Christian doctrines. So it's interesting, as we see in the connections between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament and later the Quran, how the foundational text is found in the Hebrew Bible. So we'll be looking at the 3 Isaiahs. And yes, there are 3. It's thought that there were 3 authors at 3 very distinct historical moments. Then we'll be looking at Ruth, which I think is so beautiful. Whither thou goest, I will go. So it's Ruth, who is a Moabite woman. The Moabites were reviled by the early Hebrews because they were a primary enemy. But here, Ruth is originally a Moabite. She decides to follow her Israelite mother-in-law, and then ultimately is given credit as being the ancestor to King David, and in the New Testament to Jesus. Job, I have to cover Job just because it's so famous. And there's so many ways to look at Job. One of them is through a lens of disability, actually. Another is through understanding that even though you're wealthy and you have children, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're blessed for all of life. What happens on your inside and the good deeds that you do to others is really what earns you good credit. And of course, faithfulness to God. And Song of Songs, this erotic love poem, is thought to have been written early on, perhaps 3,000 years ago, in 1000 BC or earlier, because it resembles Egyptian erotic songs and love songs. But this creation is used by the time of Jesus, whether it's the rabbis or the early Christian patristic writing, as an allegory. So for the rabbis, for the Jewish leaders, it's used to represent the king, represents God, and the woman represents Israel. In the Christian allegorical reading, the king is the church and the people are the followers, or the king is Jesus and the Christ and the people are the believers. So here we begin. I just thought I'd mix things up a little bit to put a historical frame on this. Remember, well before we were talking about the Exodus when the Israelites were in Egypt. So this was well before 1000 before the Common Era when these particular readings are relevant to. But you can see that circumcision was something practiced in the Middle East and adopted by the Israelite people as a sign of loyalty to God. Now back to the topic and the historical period. Our first historical period is that controlled by the Assyrian Empire. And we can see here that the Assyrian Empire is very dominant. In fact, by 671 before the Common Era, it controls all of what we would think of as the Middle East, even into Egypt. You remember how powerful the Egyptian Empire was. And we can also remember that in 722 before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire conquered northern, what was considered Israel, actually, the northern part of the United Kingdom. Only Judah of the Israelite kingdom remained, and that's shown in yellow. So you can see the waxing and waning of empires has significance in terms of the various production of literary expression in the Hebrew Bible. Here we have the Persian Empire. So we can see by the time of the destruction of the first temple in 586 before the Common Era, the Babylonians ruled the region. And then by 539, when the Jews were in exile in Babylonia, the Persians ruled the region. And it was during this Persian period, two important things happening. One, Cyrus is considered a Messiah in the Jewish tradition because when Persia conquered Babylonia, he let the Jews free and allowed them to return back to their homeland. Another important thing that we'll be learning about is that Persia was a Zoroastrian civilization at this time. Don't forget, this is way before Islam develops. And from this Zoroastrian tradition, as we've mentioned before, we have the idea of a well-developed priesthood, and we can see the priestly portions of the Hebrew Bible. They were advanced scientifically and observed the skies. Astronomy was important, and so we have very logical organization of rituals. So again, an important aspect that affected the Hebrew people or the Israelites who were exiled in 586 because of the Babylonian conquest and then released back in 536 by King Cyrus. And in this historical context, we have three Isaiahs. So it will be important for you to recognize the three Isaiahs and the various sections of the Hebrew Bible. So Isaiah 1 through 39 represents the Israelites who are getting political advice. They are Isaiah is telling them to watch out for the Assyrians, to watch out for the Greeks, to watch out for the Egyptians, and it's very much a sort of a warning, cautionary kind of an Isaiah. And up until 722, when the Assyrian Empire conquers that northern Israel. Then we see the Babylonian destruction of the first temple. The Babylonians had conquered the Assyrians. So in 586, the Jews are exiled by King Nebuchadnezzar's military back to Babylon. And it's thought that the leaders go to Babylon, so not every Israelite or every Hebrew citizen in that region goes, but the leaders are thought to have gone. And they are in condition of exile until the Persian Empire, and we just saw the map below, allows them to return, specifically King Cyrus in 536 before the Common Era. And what we see is the difference in the tone of Isaiah. So again, the first Isaiah, caution, political warnings, Isaiah 1 through 39. And then we look at Isaiah 2, Isaiah chapters 40 to 55. So you would want to see and recognize the Isaiah of comfort, the soft Isaiah, the Isaiah that is attempting to console, to help the bereaved of having lost their nation, their empire, their identity. And then we see in Isaiah 3, so this is after the return of the release of the Israelites from Persia by King Cyrus in the return. They began to build the second temple, and Isaiah 56 to 66 is that there's a hope of a coming Messiah, a messianic age, a prophet, a prophetic tone of perhaps the future glory, the future identity of a better time. And so we see in the New Testament references to this third Isaiah where the mission, the messianic message is clear, where there's a young girl who gives birth to the future Messiah. It doesn't say a virgin, it says a young girl. So it's important to notice the three different tones in the end. If you look at the notes uploaded into the website, you will see more details and much of what I said in the notations. As we mentioned, we get to the wisdom literature, which includes Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Ruth is considered one of them. Again, she was a Moabite. You can see the kingdom of Moab on the map. They were a constant enemy. You can see they were on the other side of the Dead Sea, east of the Dead Sea, to the kingdom of Judah on the west, and a constant concern. So for Ruth, a Moabite woman, then, to follow Naomi, her mother-in-law, who was an Israelite or a Hebrew, and say that I will take on your religion and I will follow you, this is certainly dramatic. And so they decide to leave Moab and to go back to Judah, where Naomi reunites with her people and reunites with Boaz, with whom Ruth beds, and their child is an ancestor of King David, and according to the New Testament, an ancestor of Jesus. It's so beautiful. Whither thou goest, I will go. Enjoy. In Job, we have really the first appearance of the word Satan in all of the Hebrew Bible. It's mentioned once, but not at all in any context, and certainly not any domination of a sin or evil or the embodiment of evil. According to the Hebrew Bible, Satan represents, or evil represents, misbehavior. This is very distinct from the doctrine of original sin that the Christians developed later on. So we see how Satan, as is in the original, would be called Satan, is a character from the medieval Middle Eastern ancient landscape, a literary term. The idea is he's a tempter. He's a sign of an individual missing the mark. This is what is considered to be bad. So one wonders, as we read Job closer, was Job a status seeker? Did he give to charity just to appear to be important? And some of the conclusions are just that Job was not the perfect that we often think, the perfect sufferer, that maybe he did have some hubris, that maybe he did recognize that he was vulnerable and should be humble. Another element which I came to realize, because of course it's very problematic that this basically good person Job seems to be punished by having his children slaughtered, taken away from him, and having new children born to him. Obviously, the second generation of children could never replace the first generation. But what it has made me think of is sometimes in life, great tragedies hit us, and we have a new start. So, for example, Holocaust survivors, many of whom lost their children. I know of a dear friend is the second batch, represents the second batch of children of his parents who survived the Holocaust, but whose two first sons were killed in concentration camps. So it just is so human and so emblematic of the human experience now. Then we come to the Song of Songs. Obviously, the Song of Songs, as we've mentioned, is reflective of early Egyptian erotic poetry, which would indicate 1,000 before the Common Era, or considerably before. But it is used in the rabbinic tradition and later by the Christian patristics. So this, in the rabbinic tradition, this is after the birth and death of the historical Jesus. So this would have been about 100 of the Common Era, 200 of the Common Era. The king is thought of as Jesus, and the relationship between Jesus and the church is emblematic of the king and the Shulamite maiden. So not at all thought of as an erotic love story between two human beings, but rather a big picture, an allegorical picture about showing faith in God or faith in the church and Jesus Christ's promise of salvation. So what we will take away from this is that the variety of kinds of writing in the Hebrew Bible very much reflects a historical context. And perhaps we don't need to know the historical or geographic context. Personally, I find it fascinating, and it helps me to become more in tune with the passion, the tragedy, the joys, the celebrations, all of the human experience that can be identified within these stories. See you next time.